There are a lot of things happening at the same time in the automotive industry in North America.
A 25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States. If they're made in the United States, there's absolutely no tariff.
General Motors is the latest car maker to feel the pain of President Trump's tariffs. The company says it lost $1.1 billion from its bottom line this past quarter.
The trade war hasn't simply eaten into earnings by massively increasing the cost of the raw materials that make the vehicles. It's also changed what type of vehicles consumers are buying. Last year, both the federal government and many provincial governments were offering thousands of dollars in rebates for consumers to buy electric vehicles. This was part of Canada's goal to hit a target of 20% of new sales being EVs by 2026 and 100% by 2035. Those rebates have either been reduced, paused, or cancelled altogether across the country, in an effort to protect the auto industry and save the government money during this uncertain trade environment. It had the predictable result of causing EV sales to plummet, putting Canada's EV targets essentially out of reach. But across the ocean sits a solution to this problem. China is producing EVs at a monumental rate. Last year, the globe made about 90 million cars. This year, China predicts they can produce 35 million themselves. China's technology is about 5 years ahead of everyone else. Their batteries are better, more environmentally friendly, and cheaper, and their cars have a range of around 300 kilometers at a cost of just over 14,000 Canadian dollars. Yet Canada and the US have a 100% tariff on these cars and don't import them, resulting in retaliatory tariffs from China that hurt our agricultural industry. So why won't Canada buy these cars? Well, first let's talk about why we should buy them. First of all, let's look at Canada's EV mandate. Canada's top emitting industry is oil and gas. In 2023, oil and gas emitted 208 megatons of carbon dioxide. Not far behind was transportation, at 156.6 megatons. A study on the impact of reaching the EV mandates found that initially effects would be slow, since the mandates are for new sales and there would still be a lot of gas-powered cars on the road. But by 2050, reaching the EV mandate would result in an 8% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to a scenario with no mandate. The problem, generally, is that EVs are really expensive. If consumers can even find an EV on a lot, which is actually not that common, they cost on average $15,000 to $20,000 more than an equivalent gas car. Meanwhile, rebates that make the cars affordable depend on taxpayer dollars, which isn't ideal either, especially in the current economic climate. And to add to that, there's a pronounced lack of charging stations across the country, which is a chicken-egg situation. People who can't afford EVs sometimes don't buy them because there aren't enough places to charge them. And there aren't enough places to charge them because no one invests in that infrastructure because not enough people are driving EVs. So people are not going to buy EVs because they're way too expensive, unless they're subsidized by the government, which costs taxpayer dollars. But not hitting EV targets would mean that other industries would have to make up that 8% in reductions, in the midst of the country talking about huge new nation-building projects that are certain to include mines and possibly a pipeline. Solution? Chinese EVs. They're so cheap. Of course, it's not that simple. Many European countries have adopted Chinese EVs. China has captured about 10% of the market share in Norway, a country where 98% of new vehicle sales are EVs. So what's the reason for North America's huge tariff? The obvious answer is protectionism. North America in particular is trying to protect GM, Ford, and other auto manufacturers. But shouldn't a free market mean the best product wins? How did China get so far ahead? There are a couple of main reasons. One is costs. China has low labor costs. For example, hourly wages of $4.20 versus $29. They have localized supply chains that keep prices low. Their batteries are nearly 25% cheaper than in North America, and they have a huge robotic workforce that automates much of production. But the tariffs are largely designed to correct a different force: subsidies. When politicians or automakers talk about keeping Chinese EVs out because they'll flood the market with artificially cheap cars, they have a point. The Chinese government has subsidized their EV industry by $30 billion since 2009. It's sort of the same principle as Saudi Arabia getting into sports. They don't have to worry about making a profit. They're just throwing money at something to get as much market share as possible, which will eventually become profitable down the road and also spread power and influence. North American automakers cannot possibly keep up with the price of Chinese cars, not just because of the technological gap and lower wages, but because those North American companies are focusing on profit rather than market share and influence. At a time when North America's big automakers are posting billions of dollars in losses, and trade negotiations between Canada and the US seem to be going nowhere, flooding the market with cheap, subsidized Chinese EVs would create an even bigger crisis for domestic auto production, an industry that produces hundreds of thousands of jobs in Canada. So that's the big reason, but it's not the only reason. You might remember back in 2023, Canada banned Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications giant, from installing 5G network equipment in the country. All of the Five Eyes nations did so, because there were concerns that installing that equipment would give China the ability to engage in cyber espionage. Similar conversations happen around TikTok, and the same conversations are happening around Chinese cars. A typical EV has about a dozen cameras, a number of sensors, radars, and a complicated computer that collects and transmits a lot of data. Chinese government employees driving Teslas have been banned from driving their Teslas to work because of this. There are real concerns that the Chinese government, or even a foreign hacker, could access the data collected by these cars and use it for a number of different purposes. The last major reason for the tariffs and lack of Chinese EVs in Canada is a bit of a flimsy one. Canada followed suit with the Biden administration when enacting the 100% levy, and there's been a lot of speculation that the levy remains in place to appease Trump and improve relationships between the two countries. But that is clearly not working. Experts are divided on this. Some say it's best to keep the levy, even if it doesn't have a positive effect on our relationship with the US. Others say the levy is part of Canada's decade-long policy of playing little sibling to the United States, and that we should decide our own future, independent of them. That argument is bolstered by the fact that China responded to our car levy with $4 billion in tariffs on Canadian agricultural products, such as canola oil and pork. Many are asking why we are hurting our farmers while preventing consumers from getting cheap EVs, in part to appease the US, who is hostile towards us, and sandwiching ourselves in a trade war between the world's two biggest economies. Part of Biden's fear was that Chinese automakers like BYD could use Canada as a side door to access the US. And BYD has lobbied hard to get a stake in Canada, even teasing that they could bring manufacturing here, although that's not likely to happen. But with Trump working to decouple the Canadian and American auto sector anyway, that threat is less important to consider. So we understand the reasons for and against importing these Chinese cars, but what are the ways forward? Well, we can keep doing what we're doing and levy them and refuse to import them. North American automakers have predicted they're about 5 years away from producing an EV around the same price point as China, but who knows if that's true or not. So we can miss our EV targets, wait to see if the North American industry comes around, and shake our fist at China in the meantime. Or we could do what the EU has done, which is create a formula that determines tariffs for each Chinese vehicle, rather than a blanket 100% tariff. Chinese EVs are still grabbing tons of market share in the EU, but the tariffs help to keep prices competitive with European producers and compensate for China's government subsidies. Or we can drop tariffs altogether and let cars flow, but that's not going to happen. The fear is that the trade war with the US, which is heavily damaging the auto industry, will put North American cars even farther behind, and lobbying by big manufacturers will cause Canada's government to completely ignore EV targets, as the US has. In that case, North American companies will not have the incentive to develop new EV technology, as the government has removed any real competition. They don't have to tangibly compete with Chinese EVs, so why not just keep making diesel trucks, which people in Canada like anyway? This whole issue is a fascinating look at the way that advocates of the free market come up against the needs to protect domestic industry. In a true free market scenario, people would buy the car they want. China is making better cars faster, so they should win. If Ford and GM can't compete, they lose. That's how capitalism works. In a way, the levy on Chinese cars is another bailout for the North American auto industry, to compensate for their lack of innovation. But on the other hand, it protects hundreds of thousands of Canadian jobs, and an industry that adds tens of billions of dollars a year to the economy. On the other hand, in the current climate, Canada is likely to not even get close to our EV targets, raising emissions, which of course make climate change worse, while also putting more of a burden on other industries to reduce their emissions in order to meet targets. In the end, there's no simple answer to whether or not Canada should import Chinese EVs, or whether or not North American manufacturers can catch up.